So 3 will contribute.
Okay, so welcome everyone, it's a real pleasure and an honor to introduce our speaker, Alison Gopnik, who Alyosha here calls a campus treasure, very appropriately. So Alison has devoted her career to thinking about, to establishing the case that that babies are much smarter than we think, and more recently, to understanding what we can, what we can learn from babies when we are doing designing artificial intelligence. She recently, I think this year, got the Rummelhart Award, which is for her lifetime's work in the foundations of cognitive science. It's, if you will, it's the Turing Award of cognitive science. So when my son was 2 years old, I read Alison's book on the scientist in the crib, and it resonated with and amplified my own feelings about the subject. So following that, I decided to experiment with abandon on my son. And I'm sure that when, later in life, when he inevitably blames his parents for ruining his life, we'll actually have an accomplice in it. So, please welcome.
And thank you all so much for, let's see, I probably don't really need it. Let's see if this is working. Okay, great. I think I can just talk anyway. So thank you so much for having me. What I'm going to do today is try to get through a number of different ideas and a number of different research, lines of research work, and I'm, No, but, oh yes, now it's red. Is that right?
Oh, it's not muted. Okay.
Yes. Is that okay? Good. And I'm going to sort of speed through at lightning speed, and if you want to know more, then just get in touch and we can go into more of the details. So what I've been doing, as Umesh said, sorry, and if you want the general picture that I'm going to be talking about here in some more detail, this is a new paper that just came out in an old-fashioned peer-reviewed journal, Perspectives in Psychological Science, and it talks about the general theoretical ideas, and it will give you details about the first couple of studies that I'm going to talk about. And then I'm going to talk about a couple of studies that are just in progress at the moment. Okay. So what I've been doing for the last 20 years is trying to follow this injunction of Turing's. So in the famous Turing paper, the imitation game paper, he, let's see if I can try to get rid of this. In the famous Turing imitation paper, he talks about the fact that rather than trying to understand instead of trying to produce a program to simulate the adult mind, we might be better off trying to produce one which simulates the child. And there's this really interesting shift in that paper where he says, no, actually, this is the right Turing test. And the reason why he says that is because although the adult mind might tell you something about what a mind could actually do, the important thing about children is that they're actually learning to do all these things from their experience in the world. And Turing suggested that would really be the test of intelligence. And I agree with him. And increasingly, as AI has relied more and more on machine learning, people in artificial intelligence and computer science have agreed with him. So if you want to have a system that can learn to do things from its experience, then children are the best system we know of to do that. And looking at children, figuring out how it is that they can do that, can tell us something about how we could have an artificial system that could do that. But at the same time, trying to design artificial systems that can solve those problems can help to explain how it is that children, and therefore all the rest of us, understand and know as much as we do. So I'm going to talk about some of the general morals that come for thinking about AI from thinking about children. And here's the first one. Here's a very common, and I don't think even really caricatured view of how people think about AI, including people in AI themselves. And this is this view of AI systems as being like intelligent agents, like people out there in the world. And in particular, that these are systems that either or both are geniuses because they're super intelligent, or they're golems because they're super powerful and evil. And sort of the picture is that there's this thing called intelligence, and you can have a little of it or a lot of it or a whole lot of it. And the more you have of it, the smarter you're going to be, but also the more dangerous and powerful you're going to be. And that's very much the sort of implicit picture of AI. And it's been the picture of the large language models that have recently gotten so much attention in AI. And what I want to argue is that that's a really wrong picture of what intelligence is like. In particular, if you think especially about children, you realize that there's no such thing as general intelligence, whether you're thinking about it as natural general intelligence or artificial intelligence. Instead, what you have are many, many different kinds of cognitive capacities, often quite profoundly different from one another, that human beings and children use to make their way through the world. And not only are there many different diverse intelligences, but something that comes from development is that they actually are in tension with one another. They trade off against one another. So that it is literally impossible to maximize all of those intelligences at once. When you're using one kind of intelligence, you're trading off against another kind of intelligence. And in particular, the three that I'm going to talk about today, that trade-off is very well known and understood in computer science for the first contrast between exploitation and exploration. But I'm going to talk about a third kind of intelligence, transmission or culture, which also has trade-offs with the other two, with exploitation and exploration. So as people here, I'm sure, know, there's this basic tension between a system that exploits, that maximizes utility or maximizes reward, and a system that explores, that goes out and finds out about the universe, figures out what the world around it or the environment around it is like. And in the long run, having capacities for exploration seems to help you to exploit. But in the short run, the kind of intelligence that you need to explore can actually be, in fact, characteristically is in tension with the kind of intelligence that you need to exploit. And in a whole other talk, a whole other set of papers, I've argued that childhood is actually evolution's way of resolving this explore exploit tension, and doing something like simulated annealing. So the idea is you get this early period where you can explore, and then you can put that exploration to use to exploit later on in life. Yeah, I'm trying. Yeah, I was trying to quit Zoom, but it was, maybe if I just get rid of the Wi-Fi?
Explore.
Let's see, let's force quit Zoom. Okay. My joke,
Part of the lecture.
yeah, part of my joke about this is when they get the AV right, I'm going to start really worrying about the robots. Until then, I'm not. Like if they can't manage a PowerPoint, then they're not really coming to take over. And I have noticed that the more sophisticated and computationally the audience is, the more likely it is that the AV is not going to work. So I have never succeeded in giving a talk at Google without a failure. So you guys are in good company. Okay. So we have these two very different kinds of capacities for exploitation and exploration, but there's a third one, and it's interesting from an evolutionary perspective. You could argue that the exploitation kind of intelligence is what any living creature has to have just to be able to live. The exploration capacity, the capacity to represent the environment and then use that representation and knowledge is what you get when you get a brain. That's kind of what brains are for. But this ability to transmit information from one agent to another in an efficient way is something that seems to be very characteristically human. It's what gives us our capacities for culture, for example. So this third capacity is not using representations to do things in the world, and it's also not making sure that those representations are accurate. It's being able to pass representations on from one agent to another, and to be able to acquire representations from other agents. So what I'm going to do is talk a bit more about this tension between transmission and exploration, which is a much less well-known, but still an important tension, like the exploit-explore tension. And what I want to argue, another thing to say about this is that as long as we've been human, we've had technologies which have assisted us in having these cognitive capacities. So you could argue that technology itself, any kind of tool, is a way of increasing our capacities for exploitation. Things like microscopes and telescopes and the institution of science are technologies that we use to increase our capacity to represent the world accurately. And what I'm going to argue is that we could think about LLMs as being technologies that enable us to transmit information more effectively and efficiently. So this is argument. This is rephrasing what I said before. There's a fundamental difference between the kind of cognitive capacities that enable new discoveries about the external world, things like exploration, perception, causal discovery, induction, things that let us go out into the world and find out new things about it, and the kinds of capacities that enable this kind of faithful cultural transmission, things like imitation or testimony or statistical pattern extraction from information that other people have given you. And there's a really interesting developmental cognitive science literature about things like over-imitation, for example, when people imitate everything that they see someone else do, even if it's irrelevant for the actual structure of the task. And we all kind of know examples where our tendency to imitate what we see other people doing, our tendency to accept information from other people, actually plays against our capacity to find the truth or our capacity to be effective agents in the world. That's a very common kind of tension. And what I want to suggest is that the right way to think about large models is as a kind of cultural technology, a kind of imitation engine. And in the history of humans, we've had a number of these kinds of cultural technologies, technologies that enable us to get information from others more effectively. You could argue that language is sort of cultural technology. It's the way that humans, in contrast to other animals, can easily get information about the world passed on from one person to another. And writing, of course, expands that capacity. So once we had writing, then not only were we getting information from our local postmenopausal grandmother. And by the way, there's a whole other talk about how postmenopausal grandmothers are the key to this human cultural technology. Not only could you get information from your own granny, but you could get information from lots and lots of other grannies across time and across space. And innovations of printing, again, just turn up the knob on how many people you can find out you can get information from effectively. And we also, in parallel, started to have institutions that enabled us to search through all that information effectively. So you have things like libraries, catalogs, indices, things that enable you to take that information from other people and actually make sense out of it and extract the information that you need from it. And of course, more recently, we have things like internet search, Wikipedia, are examples of kind of computationally based cultural technologies. And that's a very different picture of what these models are doing than the kind of intelligent agent who you just need a few more turns of Moore's law and it will be the super intelligent robot that will come and conquer us all. Now, on the other hand, this is not intended to be and is not a kind of reductive story. So these cultural technologies aren't just sort of, it's not to say, well, this isn't so important because it's just a cultural technology. These cultural technologies literally have changed the world. Arguably, they've changed the world more than any of our other technologies. And there's some interesting arguments in the literature about cultural evolution that our capacity to use these technologies is indeed one of the most distinctive characteristics of human intelligence. That we are in this cultural niche where our capacity to share information, pass information on from one agent to another, that's really the thing that defines our success, that's made us more successful, or not, depending on your point of view, temporarily at least, than other animals. And from the time these cultural technologies have started, people paying attention to them and thinking about them have pointed out that they have both positive and negative characteristics. This is a famous, wonderful quote from Socrates about writing. And Socrates thought that writing was a terrible idea. He thought that if you started relying on written information, two things would happen. You wouldn't be able to memorize Homer anymore, right? You'd lose your memory. Capacities for memory, and you would believe that something was true just because it was written down. So the kind of Socratic dialogue, right, that's crucial for, as far as Socrates is concerned, for truth and knowledge, doesn't happen if you've got a book, right? And he thought, essentially, that these were misinformation engines, and he was right? That's exactly true about print. That's about writing. That's one of the effects that writing has. And I especially like this last sentence where he says, they seem to talk to you as though they were intelligent, but if you ask them anything about what they say from a desire to be instructed, they go on telling you just the same thing forever, which sounds a lot like ChatGPT. So this is Socrates with, ChatGPT circa, 600 BC, which is this terrible new invention of writing. This is even more dramatically true when you think about print. And I've gone down this whole rabbit hole that I could spend hours talking about thinking about the effects of print. In the late 18th century, there were these tremendous advances in printing technology. So, there's Gutenberg who has the basic idea, but there were big revolutions in printing technology. And essentially what they meant was that anybody could print a pamphlet. So anybody who wanted to could print something and distribute lots and lots of copies of it. And there's a very good argument that that technology was what enabled the Enlightenment, that enabled all the changes in the late 18th century, or at least it played a crucial role in those changes. And this is actually Benjamin Franklin, who famously was a printer and a printer's apprentice, and he's actually printing copies of things like Tom Paine's Common Sense and the Declaration of Independence and all those kind of critical pieces of the American Revolution. So that's the good story. The great social historian Robert Darnton actually did something very clever, which was instead of just reading all the good famous pamphlets, he just read all the pamphlets. So he read all the pamphlets that were being produced, especially in France in the late 18th century with this new technology. And you will be shocked and surprised to learn that most of what people do with a new technology like this is produce softcore porn, or hardcore porn sometimes, and misinformation. So let them eat cake is actually a meme. It was actually a misinformation meme that went from one pamphlet to another. This had consequences, right? It's not like this was just, a incidental thing. Arguably, the changes in print technology led to both the American Revolution and the French Revolution. I was reading this wonderful biography of Samuel Adams recently, and there's a great passage where Samuel Adams is literally making up the Boston Massacre in the print room of the newspaper the night after it happened. So this weird, ambiguous thing happens, and he writes it up, and he gets engravings from Paul Revere, and it becomes the Boston Massacre that's famous in American history. Okay, so what do you do with this? What do you do with these cultural technologies? How do you manage to master the good and bad? And I think this is not rocket science. What happens is that you start getting norms, rules, regulations, institutions, laws that enable you to have the good of the new cultural technology and keep the bad under control. Things like testimony under oath and editors and fact checkers and all these things that don't exist before the 18th century when you have these, when you start having these technological changes. And of course, that's what we're doing now with AI. Okay, so now so that's the argument that I want to make about large models and many other kinds of AI. Rather than thinking of them as intelligent agents, you should think of them as these powerful cultural imitation engines. Now I want to shift gears and talk a bit about the other side. So if transmission is so important, and indeed it is, even young children are learning through imitation and testimony what's missing from something like a large model, what kind of intelligence is missing. And I want to argue that it's this kind of exploratory model building intelligence that's missing. And as some of the people here will know, I've been part of this DARPA Machine Common Sense program, and I discovered the main thing about DARPA is making up acronyms. So our acronym is Model Building Exploratory Social Learning Systems. And I'm going to talk a little about the model building and exploratory part of that story. So we know from 20 years of work in developmental psychology, that even very young children are constructing abstract causal models from statistics, and they're actively learning through exploratory play. And some of you have seen this before, but still, I think to make this vivid, here is actually a 4-year-old who has gotten one of the machines we call a Blicket detector that we use to figure out children's causal learning. And in this particular case, he starts out seeing that yellow makes it go and red doesn't, and then he sees an anomaly. And the study was just supposed to be about, will he change what he does based on the anomaly? But here's the kind of thing that we actually saw.
Oh. Nothing. This one's lighting up, and this one's not. So that means... What's making this light up?
I always hear, if you have any doubt that children are scientists, just look at that facial expression. We all recognize that. We've all had that feeling.
Oh, it's because this needs to be like this, and this needs to be like that. That's why. Oh. The wrong way.
This is his next suggestion.
What should we do now?
Oh, because the light goes only to here, not here. Oh, the bottom of this box has electricity in here, but this doesn't have electricity. It's lighting up. So you need to put 4. So we need to put 4 on this one to make it light up, and 2 on this one to make it light up.
Okay, so aside from being amazingly cute, and I feel like we have a moral responsibility to show cute videos if you're a developmental psychologist, there's two really interesting things about what that little boy is doing, and that's actually kind of characteristic of what we see when we give children these kinds of problems. One thing is that he's exploring the space of possible hypotheses in a way that we actually can demonstrate is much wider than the way that an adult in a similar situation would explore the hypotheses. He goes through 7 different high-level hypotheses about how the system works in the space of these 3 minutes. And the other thing is that he does experiments. So for each of those hypotheses, he performs interventions on the world to try to extract data from the world and test it against the hypotheses. And those capacities, that capacity to look through hypotheses and to intervene on the world to get data, are the things that seem to be really characteristic of this explorer intelligence. And they're exactly the things that things like large models do not do. Right? So what we wanted to do was to try and in many, many, many experiments that we've done, we've shown that children, if you give them the right kind of data, can learn these kind of over-hypotheses about how causal system works. But it's actually kind of nice when we had these, videos maybe 10 years old, and we'd see that kind of thing, and we'd think, that looks like it's really crucial, but how could we ever study it in a systematic way? And what we've been doing now is trying to see if we can use some of the tools of AI to systematically look at this kind of spontaneous, open-ended exploration that we see children doing so characteristically. And I'm going to quickly go through 4 different studies that we've done. And our basic idea is to set up an online environment that is high-dimensional, complex, and open-ended, and then to let both children and assorted AI agents explore that environment and see what they do, and then see if they're exploring the environment in a way that's actually giving them an accurate picture of the environment. And this is work with Eliza Kosoy and with several Bear students. So the first thing that we did was to take that Blicket detector that you saw that the child was playing with and put it in an online setting. So we made this online causal system. The Blicket detector is a little box that lights up when you put some things on it and not others. And the job, as that little boy had, was to figure out which ones are Blickets, how does the machine go, and to make the machine go yourself. In this, we've done tons of experiments, but in this experiment, the crucial thing is that there are different over-hypotheses you could have about the causal structure. So in particular, it could have a kind of conjunctive structure, it could have a disjunctive structure where something is a Blicket or not. If it's a Blicket, it will make it go. If it isn't, it won't make it go. That's kind of our first grown-up assumption about how a system like this would work. But it could also work on this conjunctive principle where you need to have combinations of Blickets to make it go. Just one won't work, but there's some combination that will actually be effective. And part of what you have to do in this experiment is to figure this out, is both figure out the individual Blickets, figure out what the individual properties of the objects are, but also figure out this general principle about how the machine works. And what we showed in earlier experiments was that kids were actually better at doing this than adults when there was an unlikely over-hypothesis. So adults just stick with the obvious thing and keep trying it, and the kids can find the less obvious thing. So what we wanted to do was to just let children explore, and the way we did it was with this virtual online Blicket detector. And perhaps the most interesting thing is we actually had to build the damn Blicket detectors 20 years ago because we couldn't get the kids to deal with screens. The current generation of kids are perfectly happy to do this kind of exploration on a screen. So we set up this online Blicket detector, and you can actually physically move the Blickets around. Here's an example of a child actually playing with the detector. And then what we did was we just said, figure out how this works. You can do whatever you want, just mess around, figure out how it works. And what we discovered was that we did this with 4-year-olds, is that most of the children, in the course of usually did about 20 trials that took about 10 minutes, 20 different things, fully disambiguated the causal space. So they produced the right evidence to decide whether this was a conjunctive or a disjunctive system, and to decide which ones were Blickets. And most of them got it right. Most of them figured out which ones were Blickets and which ones weren't, and figured out the over-hypothesis, when the machine was conjunctive and when the machine was disjunctive. So for each kid, the machine, in fact, as it were, the ground truth was either conjunctive or disjunctive, but the kids didn't know which. And they showed the same kind of competence when it came to intervention. So if it was disjunctive, they would just put 1 on. If it was conjunctive, they would put 2 on. So then the next question was, could large language models do this? And we actually sort of made it easy for the models because we gave them text information that was the information that the children generated. So we didn't even ask the models to generate the information themselves. We just gave them the same things that the kids had produced. You know, a red one goes on and a blue one together and it lights up, or the red one goes on, doesn't go on and it doesn't light up, and so forth. And we actually gave them all of the information, all the trials that the kids produced. And nevertheless, they were not good at solving the problem. So then when we asked them, is this obligate, is that obligate, is this obligate, at least up to GPT-3, they were not doing this accurately, and we just tried this again with GPT-4, and we found the same result. We also looked at reinforcement learning agents, which are closer to actually having the structure of intelligent agents. And we found that indeed they could solve the task, but they did it after hundreds of thousands of iterations. If you know RL, you'll know that that's true. And that was partly because even with this incredibly simple causal task, there's actually a very, very large number of potential combinations and permutations that you could have of which sets of events led to or didn't lead to the machine lighting up. And in fact, it turned out that when we looked at the end, these systems were just matching the data. They were overfitting. That's why they produced so many examples that then they just kind of had a catalog of, if you do this, then here's what the outcome will be, as opposed to the children. Okay, so that's one example of a kind of exploratory capacity, this capacity to go out, do experiments, figure out causal structure that 4-year-olds are showing tremendous competence at, and both large language models and classic reinforcement learning models are not even in the ballpark of what the children are doing. I wanted to just say one thing about GPT-4, which is, I think there's an issue, I have absolutely no doubt, and someone's probably sitting there and doing this on their laptop as we speak, that if you use the right prompts and you had enough reinforcement from human feedback, you could get the system to do something that looked like this. With GPT-4 in particular, it's very hard to know how to evaluate it because we have no idea what specific reinforcement learning it's getting and what that means for what it does. I think, in a way, something like RLHF turns up the knob on how much this is an imitation engine, because now it's really an engine that's being shaped very specifically by the responses of other human beings. I don't think RLHF isn't making the system any more exploratory. In fact, if anything, it's making it more a system that is just responding and encoding the information that other human beings have. And maybe we could talk about that a bit more in the discussion. Okay, so let me give you another example. One of the things that I think is important about our research program is we aren't just sort of saying kids can do this, can LLMs. We want to sort of in parallel see what are the capacities that humans have, try this out with various kinds of AI agents, use that information to do experiments with the kids, and vice versa. So another question that we had is about categorizing objects based on their causal functions. And go back to that point about, in cultural evolution, about imitation and innovation. We know from the cultural evolution literature that humans are extremely good at imitating what other people do. That's that cultural niche. But of course, that wouldn't do you any good unless at some point someone innovated, right? So if all we did was just imitate what our grandmothers showed us, then there wouldn't be any point in imitating because you wouldn't make any progress. So cultural evolution depends on this fine balance between imitation on the one hand and innovation on the other. So the question we wanted to ask is, where do these innovative capacities come from? And we chose a task that involved tool use, which is a kind of classic example of this innovation-imitation parallel. So you invent a new tool, and it's really useful, and then everybody around you imitates the tool, and that's an important engine of human progress. So what we did was to give kids examples where they had to sort of figure out a new use for an object that would turn it into a new tool. So here's an example. You have a tape and scissors and bandage, and one job is just figure out what goes with which, what's highly associated together. And if you have Scotch tape, everybody says the scissors are highly associated with the Scotch tape. If you're a large language model, you're going to find lots of sentences that have Scotch tape and scissors, and many fewer where Scotch tape is associated with Band-Aids. But if you raise a causal problem, so you say, okay, now I've got this torn paper, what should I use to fix it? Now you don't want the thing that's most associated with the Scotch tape. What you want, and you don't have any Scotch tape. So you explicitly say, I have this paper, it's torn, I don't have any Scotch tape, what should I use instead? Now the Band-Aids are actually the correct choice, rather than the scissors. So what we did was to have 47 scenarios, each with a different set of objects, and we asked it multiple times to the LLMs and to children and adults. And in each case, there was a superficially related object like the scissors, a functional but not related, superficially related object, and a totally unrelated object. And the job of the children and the adults and the models was to say which was the right choice in different kinds of contexts. So what we did was we either asked simply, so you had to evaluate the usefulness of the different kinds of things. So we also asked which things go together. And when we asked which things go together, all the language models are very good at doing this. Not quite as good as adults and children, but very good. And GPT-4 is not significantly different from the children and adults. So what we're asking is what goes with what? Paper, does it go more with scissors, or does it go more with Band-Aids? But when we asked about the novel use, the large models did much worse. And even GPT-4 didn't do as well as children or adults did. And you can see the kind of classic language models that are really just using the statistics of language rather than reinforcement learning from human feedback are really not doing well on this task at all. So this seems to be something that you can't just extract from the statistical patterns in the text and the language that you have, or at least it's very difficult to do this. Okay. So those are examples of things that children can do, examples of exploration and innovation, where the kind of typical AI processes, and in particular large models, are not doing a good job. Now what I want to do is turn to two new studies that we've done, trying to actually see if we could use the information about what children are doing to design a new RL agent in particular that would do a better job of solving these kinds of tasks. And what we did was, again, use this idea of just sort of general exploration of a novel environment. So in the first experiment, what we did was to try to give RL agents the same kinds of intrinsic motivations that we see in children. And this is work with Yucheng Du and Li Dian, who's here, as well as Eliza Kosoy. And this was Yucheng's idea. I must admit, I think my main motivation for this is that actually knowing something about Minecraft gives me some brownie points with my grandson. I still not quite, but I've sort of pretended that I actually know what Minecraft is about. So what we did was we took a simpler form of Minecraft called Crafter, and this is a very open-ended environment. You find things, you use them, you make other things, you get rewards, but the rewards are very much downstream. And what we did was, again, just take 5 to 7-year-olds, tell them, play with this. The kids are very happy to play with it. And then we recorded what they did as they were playing with it. And then we compared that to reinforcement agents that either just were randomly producing policies or knew the ground truth, so that's kind of the other end of the control, or who were trained with information gain as a reward. So rather than actually trying to get points or get a reward, these systems were trained to try and get more information about the environment. Or else another set that were trained with trying to get more entropy. And a third set that we still are just working on that were trained using empowerment as an intrinsic reward. And I won't go into all the details, but what we could do was compare the behavior of the kids and the adults to the behavior of these different kinds of reinforcement learning engines. And again, perhaps not surprisingly, we use these different, meaning Yucheng and Li, use these different measures of how much exploration the various agents and humans did. And what we discovered was that the agents, including at least some of the children, were actually very good at doing a lot of exploration effectively. And the agents that had more intrinsic reward did better than the random agent. So that was at least a sign that adding the intrinsic reward was helping the agents to explore the space effectively, although still not as effectively as the human adults or children. And it's worth pointing out, Lee just sent me this, that the adults and children are taking about 20 minutes to do this with about 5,000 moves, and the agents are taking 1 million moves. So there's also a bit of a difference. There's also a bit of a difference on that dimension. The other thing that we found was that when we actually analyzed what the children and adults were doing in terms of information gain, entropy, and empowerment, we found that there was a significant correlation between how much what they were doing reflected this kind of reward and how much they actually explored the space effectively. So it looked as if among the different children and adults, the more they were being driven by information gain or by entropy or by empowerment, the more effectively they actually explored the space of this open-ended, game. And now let me give you the last example of a study that we've done. So that's one example where we're looking at open-ended exploration and trying to use it as a way of thinking about reinforcement learning agents, but also using the reinforcement learning agents as a way of understanding how children can do this kind of open-ended exploration so effectively. In this study, what we're doing is looking at a slightly different kind of exploration, and this involves what we call causal curriculum learning. So one of the things about humans is that we know when we get a really hard task that in order to solve that hard task, we often have to master simpler tasks to begin with. That's kind of like why you're all here, right? That's the rationale for universities, is that if you guys show up and we give you all these simple tasks, then you'll be able to go out to the valley and do really hard things. One of the things that we know is that giving people a curriculum like this, or agents a curriculum like this, helps them to solve difficult open-ended problems. But of course, what you'd really like would be able to generate that curriculum yourself. So what you'd really like would be to be able to decide yourself, this is the thing that I need to do in order to be able to do this harder thing that I can't do now. So what we did was we used another online environment. This is the ProcGen environment, which is essentially a set of different video games. And what we did was take kids, again, sort of 5 to 7-year-olds, we gave them this difficult task. This is a game called Leaper. And we said, you'll get stickers if you solve this. And none of the kids could solve it. So the kids try this, they can't figure out how it works, they can't solve it. And then we said, okay, you won't get any stickers, but you can decide now which other game do you want to play. Which one do you think you can play that will help you get the stickers in the end? And what we discovered was that even 5 to 7-year-olds were very systematic about this. So we gave them level 4, which was actually the harder level, and then various easier levels. And what we discovered, again, this is Anya and Rosemary and collaborators, is that the participants were taking the level of their progress and using that as a cue about what the next level should be that they would choose. So if they had not made very much progress, then they would choose a simpler level. If they were making progress and we could quantify this, then they would choose the harder level. So they seemed to be sensitive to how well am I doing, how much progress am I making, and used that to determine what the next thing is that they should do in order to ultimately be able to solve the difficult tasks that they couldn't solve to begin with. And in fact, a large number of them did end up being able to solve the difficult task. And then what we did was to actually do the same thing with the agents. So now what we did was to actually give the agents learning progress as a reward, as an intrinsic reward. So now the agents are getting rewarded not just for solving the task, but for how much better they're getting as they try to solve the task. And again, we're still talking about hundreds of thousands of steps for the agents versus, 10 minutes for the kids. But it is still true that giving them that kind of intrinsic reward, especially in a context where rewards are sparse, greatly improved the way that the agents were able to solve this task. Okay, so let me just conclude the kind of moral that I want you to take away. This is a fantastic novella that I highly recommend by Ted Chiang, which is about thinking about AIs growing up. And the moral that I want for this is that this kind of developmental diversity, being able to do different kinds of things, having different kinds of intelligences at different times that you can trade off against each other. And in particular, having a childhood, having this period of intense intrinsic motivation to extract information and to make progress. That seems to be one of the things that's really crucial if you're going to go beyond just transmission and cultural technology and have something that really looks like at least part of human intelligence. Okay, let me stop there, and we have some little time for questions.
Thanks, Alison. Maybe I'll ask a quick question before turning the floor over to others.
Yeah.
So, in this experiment you described about the objects, combination of objects lighting things up, maybe this is what you were getting at, that when you were comparing humans, children, babies to children to GPT, that it was active versus passive learning in the sense that, given the transcript of what somebody else has done, leaves out their intention, and that makes it much harder to make sense of it?
Yeah, I think that's right. So, when the kids are actually doing the experiments, one of the next things that we want to do is try and see if, suppose we took the kids and we just gave them randomly produced data, or we gave them data from another person, sort of behavior cloning. That's the next experiment.
Yeah.
Our assumption is they would not do as well as if they were actually generating the hypotheses and generating the experiments themselves, but we don't know whether that's true. The other dimension is just being able to do causal inference from data, which is also a challenging, as we all know, goes beyond just picking out the statistical patterns to sort of say, okay, this is what the statistical patterns tell you about causal structure.
I guess also maybe the mind boggles a little bit at thinking about what would the corresponding thing with GPT be if we were trying to make it active learning.
Yes, right. Right. I mean, I have thought about that. You could imagine a GPT-like system that tested out different sentences as hypotheses, for example, and then, was trying to get its reinforcement learning humans to give it information about specific hypotheses. As far as I know, there's nothing that's like that in those kinds of systems.
So you've told us how the children are better scientists, and I can understand why. On the other hand, you have adult scientists who are actually quite good at doing this sort of thing, and I get very frustrated. I know very many smart people, but they don't take risks, they don't explore. But otherwise they would really be great scientists. So
you see this explore-exploit trade-off very vividly if you're in an institution like science. And I think a good way of thinking about science, go back to the sort of idea of our technologies, it's a technology that allows us to take those exploration capacities that we all use when we're kids and actually institutionalize them in a way that lets you, explore distant stars or quarks instead of just exploring the light detectors and the things that are in front of you and your parents. I think that's exactly a way of thinking about it. But of course, as we all know from being scientists, the trick of being a scientist, I think more than anything else, is getting that explore-exploit balance right. So you can't just explore the way you could when you were 2, because you have to go out and get grants and do things like that, right? So you have to be at once this terrible, effective exploiter who can pull money out of DARPA, pull resources out, and be an explorer who can try lots and lots of different things. And I genuinely think this is a challenge for institutions like science or universities about how you manage to enable both of those things at the same time. But it's one of my slogans is it's not that children are little scientists, it's that scientists are big children, which always gets me a round of applause if I'm talking at, Fermi Lab or someplace like that. So.
Thank you so much. This is such a cool talk. It's very inspiring to an undergrad like me. One thing that you were talking about earlier with how children only needed like a small number of samples, I think you said 20.
Right.
Whereas the models needed like millions. Would that correspond to because fundamentally, like you said, they're generalizing.
Right.
Would that correspond to like Occam's razor or like a similar mechanism?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, one question, there are certainly people in cognitive science who've tried to say that the really crucial thing is your prior knowledge. And it's certainly true that part of the reason why the kids need so much less information is that they kind of have some general ideas about how machines work or about how video games work, and they're not simply trying every possible policy. So that's certainly part of the reason why they're using fewer steps. But it's also true that they're doing this exploration in a very directed way. And I think one of the really fascinating challenges, I couldn't resist this. I went through and said, no, I won't show this last slide. Alvy, my husband, was saying, come on, Alison, don't add slides now, take them away. But there's a fascinating recent paper that came out in Nature Human Behavior from Charlie Wu's lab. Let me see if I can, I'm not sure if I can find the slide, where what they did was actually look at, here it is, look at stochastic optimization across development. So what they did was, let's see if I can find this. Yeah. So here's the paper. What they did was actually try and look at both just how much random stuff do you produce, how high a temperature is your behavior, is your exploration, and how much directed exploration do you produce. And what they discovered, so this here is the red is the random high temperature exploration, which is just do you produce more random stuff. But the green is actually directed exploration. So it's actually exploration that's designed to solve the particular problem that you have. And they did a big reinforcement learning task, and what they discovered, which was joy to my heart, is that you really could see something like simulated annealing, where the children really were both higher temperature, were doing a higher temperature search than the adults were, but also that they were doing this kind of directed exploration. And I think the puzzle about how do you do directed exploration, you know, it's easy to see how you could just add noise to the system to make it more creative, make it have more possibilities. But how could you get it to do that in a way that is intelligent and sensible and solves the problems you want to solve? I think that's the biggest kind of unsolved, one of the biggest unsolved problems that's ahead of us. And the kids seem to be doing both of those things. And I've mentioned this before, but you know, it's sort of fascinating when I talk to people who are actually working in things like deep learning. All of them agree that temperature setting and something like annealing is crucial, that it doesn't work unless you have some way of manipulating temperature. And then I say, okay, what's the general proof, right? Like, what's the general principle about how you should alter this in order to be able to solve problems? And they say, you fiddle with it until it works, and then you fiddle with it some more so it'll work again. So I think, again, there's a great opportunity somewhere for someone to actually try and figure out more about how these two kinds of exploration fit together. Yeah?
Hi, thanks so much. Super interesting talk, really liked it. I had a question sort of related to the experiments you were showing with the bandages and the scissors and the tape, that series of experiments. I thought that was really interesting. So to me, it seems natural that something like GPT-4 wouldn't do well in this because it's a problem that's very grounded in like the physical world.
Right.
And so I was curious if you saw examples of similar sorts of behaviors happening for tasks where maybe it wouldn't be so dependent on physical world, like some sort of like simile task where you still see issues where GPT-4 is not good at kind of taking an idea out of context, I guess. Yeah.
I mean, that's a good question. We thought these were pretty simple examples, so we thought that those should be accessible. These are things that are getting described often. I mean, they're common objects. They're in the text. When we did it with GPT-4V, which is the most recent version that has the vision, it does better if you give it visual information. As well. The kids can do it just with text. So we wondered about that too. We started out giving them illustrations, but they can give you the right answer just with text. But I think that's a really good question. And you know, people talk about this grounded, embodied character of human intelligence in contrast to what you see with something like GPT. Something that I think is important to say is that even when you're talking about something like GPT-V or ImageNet or the DALL-E, the kind of visual versions of these things, they're about pictures. They're about pictures that people have decided to put on the internet. They're not about going out into a three-dimensional world and moving around and seeing all the random things that you see when you move around in a three-dimensional world. In fact, you know, the internet pictures are really well curated, so you don't get the blurry thing. That's the thing that you see as it's your visual input as you're going through the world. So I think it's even my hypothesis would be that if you had something like video data, right? If you had a very large amount of real-life video data where you're looking around the real world, maybe with a bunch of multimodal tactile data, then you're getting closer to a data source that could work. But you're still going to have this passive versus active problem. So I think even if you got to see that, the fact that you couldn't go out and actually try the experiment would limit the kind of generalization and extrapolation that you can.
Oh, interesting. Thank you.
Yeah.
I had a question about, you know, these three modes that you spoke about, you know, explore, exploit, and converge. So can you, is it possible to understand the developmental phases of children go through in terms of the trade-offs between these?
Yeah, and it's really interesting. There was another slide that I cut out. So from an evolutionary perspective, it seems as if the story is you start out exploiting, then you get animals that will explore, they have brains, and then you get humans who have a lot of cultural transmission. But from the developmental perspective, literally from the time they're born, babies are imitating. So you know, newborn babies will already imitate facial expressions and gestures that they see other people producing. So I think what actually happens with human babies is that they start out having these very strong transmission and exploration intelligences. And again, newborn babies are already exploring. They're exploring by looking around, but they're still exploring. And interestingly, they don't have the exploit capacities. So, you know, one of the things I say is babies have one utility function to maximize, and they're extremely good at maximizing, which is be as cute as you possibly can be. And all you have to do is just maximize the cuteness utility function, and then all your other utilities will be taken care of because you have nurturers and caregivers who are designed to do the exploit piece. And actually, when I've been thinking about this, there's a whole other kind of intelligence, which is this intelligence of care, of how do you actually take care of another agent so that it can have the opportunity to explore, for example. Something, again, that all of us faculty face as an issue and problem all the time. How do we enable our students to explore without dictating what it is that they should do on the one hand, or not providing them with resources on the other hand? I think really the human solution is you have a combination of children who are exploring, adults who are providing them with care, and who are exploiting so that they can survive, and then seriously, elders, grandmothers, who are both providing care and providing cultural transmission. So you've got children who are designed to explore, and then adults who are designed to exploit, and then elders, grandmoms in particular, who are designed to teach and care. That's kind of the small version, but that's a whole other story about the grandmoms. But it's that kind of combination of having a system where you have an early period where you get to both explore and imitate, and then a later period where you actually put that into operation, and then yet another period where what you do is give resources to the new generation of children who are exploring, both informational resources and other resources. That's part of what I mean about the developmental diversity. It's that whole developmental picture that enables humans to be intelligent, rather than that there's a bunch of 35-year-olds in Soda Hall who have reached the peak of, you know, possible intelligence and are out there designing machines that are going to be even more of this magical intelligent stuff than they do. Jitendra, yeah.
Yeah, wonderful. So this explore, exploit, it's not necessarily tied to the 3D world, though the child normally exhibits it in the 3D, 4D world. So, we both believe in embodiment, but the question is embodiment necessary for this kind of exploration? For the child, the typical environment is an embodied environment, but can we de-link these concepts? Can be theoretically de-linked, but are they empirically linked?
So I think they are empirically linked, but you could certainly, and I've been thinking about this with LLMs, here's a lovely statistic, which was very vivid when I was just visiting my grandchildren in Montreal, which is that your average 3-year-old produces 3 questions a minute. So it's something like 300 questions a day. That's what the empirical evidence is. So asking questions is a really interesting example of using language to do this kind of active learning. And you could imagine a 3-year-old who isn't embedded, who's just a text 3-year-old, but who goes around asking questions all the time. And asking questions in a way that will enable them to make the right kind of theoretical progress that they need. And there's beautiful experiments by Henry Wellman that show, for instance, if you have a 2 or 3-year-old who is constantly asking questions, it can feel like, okay, this is just a way of annoying adults. Henry showed that the kinds of questions they ask and their decision about whether to ask the next question depends on how much information they've gotten in the last linguistic term. So they're doing this information gain reward motivation, but they're doing it in a linguistic context. So if you think you've already got enough information, then you don't repeat the question, you go on to the next question. But if the mom has just given you an answer that isn't sufficient, that, like opium has a dormitive property, that's that kind of example, that's just an empty response, then you go back and repeat the question until you get something that actually has given you more information. So anyway, I think those are examples of things that something like question answering is an example of something that you could imagine being this kind of active learning even in a non physically embodied agent. But I think in practice, of course, most of the time what's happening is that the agents really are physically embodied and the kids are physically embodied and they're picking things up and experimenting with them and trying them, and a lot of the language is happening in that. A lot of the language is happening in that context as well. Interestingly, also happening in pretend play, which is something that children are doing when they're 2 or 3 years old. So you see children, which isn't quite embodied. Pretend is kind of an interesting thing because it's not quite the same thing as being embodied, and it's very linguistic, but it has this kind of exploratory, quality. I can't resist this because my 3-year-old grandson got taken to a bar for the first time, Doc's Tavern in Vermont, when we were visiting in Vermont. And for weeks afterwards, all of his pretend play was about Doc's Tavern. So the little baby giraffe would say to the mama giraffe, "Mama, why was it so loud?" And then the mama giraffe would say, "Because it was Doc's Tavern and they were playing pool." And then the little giraffe would say, "Mama, why is pool so loud?" And it was like, this great puzzle about how a tavern works when you're a 3-year-old. "Mama, why did they give me chocolate milk?" It was this whole question asking, but it wasn't actually getting the information from someone else. It was doing the question and answer internally, as it were, to try to sort through this novel environment, which of course, mastering the Doc's Tavern environment is very important for a child growing up.
On that, okay, I guess.
Elaine and Lee?
Hopefully it's quick. So when we're thinking about the trajectory of what children are asking, the hypotheses they're testing when they are trying to solve a obligate detector, is there work that looks at the variation among children's strategies, even within the same cultural background or across different cultural backgrounds? I'm curious if people have looked into how language or prior experience might affect that.
Yeah, so that's a really good question. And language actually seems to play an interesting role. So in terms of just even identifying what a causal problem is, there's really interesting work that we've done that with toddlers, with 1-year-olds, they treat something as causal if it's the result of a human action or if a human describes it in causal terms. So if you say, "Look, the blicket makes the machine go," to a 2-year-old, then they treat it as if it's causal. 3-year-olds, you don't have to use language. They've already kind of got it, that when you see this kind of artifact, that's what it does. Or else, if you actually put something on the machine, but if they just see the machine producing the contingencies without a human involved, they don't treat it as if it's causal. They just treat it as if it's statistical. The other thing is, somewhat to my surprise, we did this exactly this conjunctive-disjunctive experiment in low-income kind of favelas in Peru and in Head Start programs, and the kids are just as good. In fact, the Peruvian kids are more likely to get to the unlikely hypothesis than the American kids, which I suspect is because they're doing much more exploration in their everyday lives than the privileged, helicoptered, American 4-year-olds are. So, that's just one study starting out, but that's one of the things that we'd be interested in seeing. My guess, and this is only a guess, is that a lot of the individual differences in kids are not about, are they brighter or are they less bright or whatever, but what kinds of things are epistemically motivating to them. So some kids definitely, physical objects interacting with one another are captivating and important and interesting. Other kids, their own body in the world is captivating. Other kids, social relationships and people are captivating. And my hypothesis is that a lot of the differences that you see are really those differences in what kinds of things you're epistemically motivated to solve, rather than your kind of basic capacities for doing things like causal inference. But I don't have any data about that. Lee?
Okay, last question.
Last question. Thank you, Lee.
Thank you. I think that idea of information transmission across generations is super interesting. And I see like these 3 ways information is transmitted. One through like the drive to imitate.
Right.
One through the drive to explore. Like in some ways that's a form of information that's telling you how to get more information.
Yeah.
And then finally through just genes passed down, and that you have sort of instincts that you're born with. And I'm curious, like, what work has been done or existing theories on how it's sort of decided what information is transmitted through what mode?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, and there's a very large and very interesting literature, including a computational literature, about cultural evolution that tries to quantify when, and do this empirically. Tom Griffiths, who used to be here, has, and Bill Thompson, who's here now in psychology, who you should get to come and give a talk, has done these lovely experiments about transmitting information from one person to another. And sort of like the game of telephone, right, where someone solves a problem and then they're supposed to pass on the information to the next person who passes it on to the next person and so forth. And there's a lot of really interesting features of what happens in the course of that information transmission. One thing that happens is you get this kind of reversion to the prior. That's one of the things that Tom discovered. So very often what happens is you end up, even if you've gotten new information, you end up just reverting to the thing that you started out with, to the information you had to begin with. And it takes a lot of work to actually get the information transmitted across many, many people, or across many generations. And there's a really interesting, there's theories that things like prestige matter. So there's a weird but nice hypothesis, which is the reason why we have dominance hierarchies isn't actually about dominance. It's about having clear people who you should be imitating. It's a way of solving these cultural transmission problems. There's probably developmental things. Famously, adolescents are more likely to be innovators, but are also more likely to imitate other people who are innovators rather than people who they see as long-term. But it's a really, really interesting set of questions. And I think one of the things that's come up a bit with the LLMs now is, I was just reading a paper about this, like suppose you passively imitated expert experimenters. And there's just a paper that came out that was like, you could get LLMs to look a little more intelligent in these contexts by having them imitate someone who was an expert experimenter. And again, that's kind of like what we do when we're, that's what all of us do as students and faculty. But of course, the students what we really want our students to do is not even do the methods the same way that we do, let alone come to the same conclusions. We want them to invent new methods or bootstrap new methods.
Thanks.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for the questions.